In 1913, Sir Vincent Raven introduced his D-Class 444 tank engines to the Northeastern Railway. They were made for light expresses on shorter distances. A year later, an order for another 20 was placed, but it was cancelled due to the beginning of the First World War. 25 more would be built between 1920 and 22. At this time, their work consisted mainly of coastal trains and fast suburban services, which they did fairly well. They were quite strong for their wheel arrangement, but did prove unpopular. In their post-grouping life, they'd be reclassified as H1s. At this time, they'd work alongside a new batch of A5s, built specifically to work where the H1s were stationed. Pacific Tank, initially built by the Great Central Railway for the same purpose as the H1s, but better. This made the weaknesses of the H1 stand out like a sore thumb. The A5s were stable, superheated, fast suburban engines, with one being recorded at 70 miles per hour. In comparison, the H1s had less driving wheels and thus less adhesion. They had smaller boilers and fuel capacity, if only by a small margin, and it's believed that this comparison led to the creation of the A8 class, all rebuilds of the H1s. In 1931, Sir Nigel Gresley rebuilt one H1, number 2162, into an A8, and it had a 2-year testing period, after which it was decided to rebuild every H1 into this class. The old H1 boilers were given Robinson superheaters in place of the old Schmidt type. The boilers would be changed again in 1935 to be made interchangeable with several of the LNER's other large tank engines. These new A8s would replace the now quite old G5 tanks on heavy suburban trains and longer distance runs along the coast. They proved effective, but nothing super special. When the 1950s rolled around and diesel railcars began popping up all over the BR network, the A8s were put to shame. They were decent engines, sure, but the diesel railcars were cheap, easy to maintain, and far easier to manufacture. The first A8 was withdrawn in 1957, and the class was extinct by the end of 1960. The last of the A5s that inspired this rebuild were all withdrawn around the same time as well. Thomson L1s and those diesel railcars taking up all their work, the A5s and A8s being long-lived in comparison to other Pacific tanks of the LNER, but both of Gresley's Prairie tanks outlived these, too. If only by a little bit. Unless I'm missing something here, the V3 tanks lived the longest out of the LNER's large tank engines, surviving just past Thomson's younger L1s. In truth, this was always going to be the fate of large tank engines. With standard tanks coming in and railcars taking over suburban services, their entire purpose was gone, filled by more effective, easier to maintain, and easier to man machines. The A8s weren't even the most effective thing the LNER had for their job, and when BR took over, it was understandably eager to replace them. After all, the standard 4 tanks were faster, stronger, weighed the same, and were cheaper to repair when weighing the same and only being slightly longer. Those same standard tanks only lasted a short while longer anyway, due to BR's modernization plan. Brief history ripped from this website aside, these engines have an interesting look to them. Not super refined, but not particularly clumsy. They look okay in black and apple green. Maybe it's the totally straight running board and straight-edged tanks, but they seem rather square for a steam engine. What stands out to me is the cylinders. They seem quite small next to the massive body of the locomotive itself. I chose to do this video because I like big tank engines, and I stumbled upon this model on the train's download station, so it was time. I wanted to get a little variety on this channel as well anyway, and we had one small southern tank engine and one small southern tender engine, and now a large northeastern tank engine. Hopefully more to come next week. It's likely to be another LNER engine just because that's what I've recently downloaded. Maybe a tender engine this time. Like, subscribe, all that jazz. I'm off to play trains.